Welcome to the Global Apparel Sourcing Expo, an event organized by the International Apparel Federation. I am Godeke Wessel from ForSource. We are the technology partner of the International Apparel Federation for hosting this event. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Julie Hughes from the United States Fashion Industry Association, who will give an outlook on the US sourcing trends and perspectives from the United States perspective. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Godeke, and I'm so pleased to be here and to join the Global Apparel Sourcing Expo. This is really exciting opportunity. I'm in my dining room and you all are at home as well, but we're going to be able to talk today about some of the current trends and outlook going forward. So I'm going to jump into a PowerPoint presentation and try to give an overview of what's happening here in the US. I want to just start with two slides about USFIA, the US Fashion Industry Association. First, our motto, what we are working toward as an organization is fashion made possible by global trade. Our focus is on trade, expanding trade, enhancing trade, and the global perspective as much as possible. Our members and affiliates include a range of companies from the industry: brands, retailers, importers, service providers, manufacturers of products, supplier association, and groups around the world. But what I really want to jump into today, and I'm very excited to talk about this because we are just releasing our 2020 benchmarking study. So you're one of the first groups to hear about some of the results from that study. We had a survey of executives at leading US fashion industry companies, most of them with more than 1,000 employees, 68%, but also some with 101 to 999 employees. So we try to cover the perspective of both large companies and those that are not as large. The respondents were from throughout the fashion industry, and we covered three topics: business environment and outlook, which is mainly what I'm going to talk about today, sourcing practices, and then some viewpoints on trade policy. So first up, I think top of mind, I think, for everybody who's participating today is let's look at the business environment and the business challenges in 2020. So pretty much no surprise, the top challenge is obviously the economic and business impacts of COVID-19. This wasn't a topic in any of our past surveys, of course, but obviously it is top of mind and it is affecting everything in our business today. What I thought was interesting, though, were some of the other responses, because we gave respondents a series of answers that they could say for what are their top concerns. And managing supply chain risks, protectionist trade policy agenda are two that I think are really linked from our US perspective of the impact of the trade wars on our business for daily operations. And of course, increasing production or sourcing costs have always been a concern. Last year, they were the top concern, and that still is a concern today, but we have much more deep issues that we're dealing with right now. So this study was done along with Dr. Sheng Liu at the University of Delaware here in the US. And Dr. Liu put together this table that I thought is really helpful as we look at the broader perspective of what can we compare today's issues with, right? We haven't had anything like a pandemic of COVID-19. We haven't really had many other disruptions, but the closest thing we could look at was the global financial crisis in 2008. So Dr. Liu pulled the data to look at what happened to trade, how much did trade fall to the US when we were in the global financial crisis versus what's happened during the first 5 months of 2020. Now that's the most recent data that we have from the US government right now. And of course, for the first few months, we were not reacting to COVID. But you can see so clearly in this graphic, and you all will be able to see this PowerPoint at your leisure another time, that when we were back in 2008 in the global financial crisis, Even then, we never saw a decrease in the US imports of apparel from China. It fell to only 2% growth, but we still had some growth from China, while the rest of the world had falling trade with the US market. And obviously, COVID has hit us totally differently, where for this year, our apparel imports from China are down by 49%. And they're down substantially from most of the other top suppliers to the US market. So this is really an impact on our business that we have never seen before. When we asked companies to talk about the impact on their own business operations, once again, some of this seems quite obvious. 100% said it's disrupted the supply chain, which, of course, that has happened. What I thought was interesting, though, as well, is that a large percentage said the factories making their products were short of workers. So we are influenced and affected, obviously, by the global impact of the pandemic. Top concern also for companies was that COVID made it more difficult to conduct factory audits. And I think that factory audits and the fact that that was an issue with a high percentage of the respondents reflects the fact that we know this is not a permanent shift. We know that business operations are going to come back. So companies are still focused on the factory audits. So while that is, I think, semi-positive, more negative, of course, is that more than 2/3 said they had to furlough or lay off US-based employees. And I think this is the aspect that here in the US, we are still dealing with those layoffs. We have companies that still have employees on furlough, and we are anticipating that there will be more layoffs as we go through this year. Last impact, just to mention, is that apparel factories which make products were short of raw materials. And I think that this response probably reflects more the timing of our survey, because the survey was in April and May. So that was particularly the time, I think, when supply chains were having difficulties with having the availability of inputs. If we want to just look at the financial aspect, and don't have to spend a lot of time with this slide, just to say that obviously almost every company said they expect sales revenues to decline in 2020. And my guess is that if we could go back out and ask whoever didn't expect it, they would now have said they've seen those sales revenue decreases. We also saw that when we asked the question about cancellation of orders, which I know has been controversial and has been a difficult issue for all of us throughout the supply chain, what we saw is that almost everyone was canceling orders in the second quarter of 2020 when stores were closed and most of the global economies were shut down. But we still see a percentage, particularly of retailers who have postponed or canceled orders for third quarter and beyond third quarter of 2020. The impact of when we're going to get back, and I'm not going to talk about what's happening with COVID today in the US, but obviously we are still in the throes of dealing with the impacts of COVID, and the expectation that there will be orders postponed or canceled, I think it makes a lot of sense, unfortunately. We also asked companies to respond on where did they cancel the orders, and not surprisingly, the majority of cancellations were from China, and I think that relates to the figure in the earlier slide showing that much of this was concentrated in second quarter. But also cancellations from Bangladesh and from India. Those three Asian suppliers were the most affected by the order cancellations. One thing that we've done, this is our 7th benchmarking survey, and one thing that we have looked at throughout that time period is what's the 5-year outlook? So not just what's happening today, but what do you see for 5 years? And this is unfortunately the lowest number that we've seen for a response that is optimistic or somewhat optimistic for the next 5 years. I think that response is totally colored by what we're going through right now with COVID, but also suggests that we're not going to be quickly out of this problem. One positive thing to note is that respondents, though, were still saying they plan to hire more employees in the next 5 years. Almost 90% of respondents said that. Now, most The positions most likely to be hired are sustainability and compliance, supply chain, including logistics, sourcing, and data. And pretty much continuing with what we've seen in our survey for US-based companies, sewing machine operators and general management are not where the new positions are going to be. So I'd like to turn now briefly to talking about sourcing practices, what we saw in the survey about the sourcing base. We continue to see, and 100% of the respondents said that they do some sourcing in China. And 95% did do some sourcing in Vietnam. So we continue to see those as the two largest locations. But I want to note that if we look at our top 10, it includes the US as well. The top 8 are Asia suppliers, but number 9 US and number 10 Mexico, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So for the companies that are larger, most of them, 62%, said that they source from more than 10 countries in 2020. And smaller companies, companies with less than 1,000 employees, 2/3 of them say that they source from fewer than 6 countries in 2020. So I think we're seeing again that for smaller companies, there may be more consolidation. Larger companies with larger quantities required are continuing to source more widely. But our basic bottom line here is the same, is that for most sourcing executives, China plus Vietnam plus many remains the model. So for most of the respondents, China and Vietnam combined are 40 to 60% of their total sourcing value or the sourcing volume. What was really interesting this year is we did see an increase, a little bit of an increase in the number of respondents who said they source more from Vietnam than from China. And when we try to look at beyond those two, it's very widespread: US, North America, South and Central America, which are for geographic proximity, AGOA for duty-free for us in Africa, and Europe. All of those typically are less than 10% of the sourcing portfolio. Now, I want to just insert here about trade policy because we're talking about China and how important China is. But part of what is happening with China is that the US is continuing to collect a lot of tariffs from the Trump trade wars. So most important is if we look at China and imports from China that are subject to the Section 301, it's more than $56 billion in extra tariffs that have been collected this year, which far exceeds the impact on any other countries. With the EU 301, almost $600 million for our steel tariffs, $7.1 billion, aluminum tariffs, $2 billion, less than that in what we call our Section 201 tariffs, which are our tariffs on solar panels and on washing machines. So overall, though, the US has collected a lot in these tariffs, and as we know, for the tariffs on goods from China, a lot of that is on the consumer products that the retailers and brands who are completing our survey are the ones importing. So that kind of leads us to, if we're looking at sourcing and what's the impact of COVID-19 and the trade war on sourcing, sourcing costs remain a big concern. And some of the biggest concerns, increases in shipping and logistics costs, where we see pretty much across the board a substantial amount of companies concerned about that, and increases in labor costs. Costs of and increases in textile raw materials. Those are the three where we saw the biggest concern immediately about increasing sourcing costs for this year. We also saw that, for most of the companies that responded, they are continuing to say that they want to reduce their reliance on China as the source of the products that they are importing. Only 33% now source more than 30% of their products from China, which is down substantially from 45% last year and 58% in 2017, really before the trade wars got started, where China was consistently the dominant supplier for sourcing. What did companies do? So we asked what measures had companies taken, and I just want to note that 100%, up from 77% last year, but everybody said we moved some sourcing orders from China to other Asian suppliers. And I think that's a key takeaway. And the second item, where 70% said that vendors in China lowered their price to keep the sourcing orders. So that a lot of the efforts this year in responding to COVID and the trade wars is to try to keep some of these supply chains still in place for reliability. But when we look at the data, that's clearly, there is no argument that US sourcing is reducing the dependence on China as our #1 source of supply. And this graphic, which I think kind of terrifically shows what's happening with the market share for US apparel imports from China, where now Vietnam and China are pretty much tied for top supplier compared to the rest of the world. I also want to just briefly mention the impact and the importance of sustainable and ethical sourcing, because there have been many articles saying that the COVID response, it means that companies are not paying as much attention on sustainability, and that's not the case for what we found. 70% of the respondents said that they will allocate more resources for sustainability and social compliance over the next 2 years. And in the face of layoffs and furloughs and the loss of sales that brands and retailers have been seeing, I think that that is a really strong statement of the commitment from companies to sustainability and ethical sourcing. 100% of the respondents said they audit suppliers, and 85% said they use third country certifications to audit suppliers, which once again, I think is a very positive development and reflects that commitment by the brands and retailers. When we ask companies, this graphic just kind of shows that, the impact in 2020 compared to past years, where, almost 2/3 of companies say we conduct our own audits and we use third-party certification to audit. And I think that that is the trend that is growing. I think last week here at the Expo, you all talked a bit about this, and I think that's a very positive development. So each year in our survey, we try to do what is kind of the Yelp survey, or how can we rank different destinations for what are the key issues for sourcing executives. And we look at 5 different issues: speed to market, which has always been a big issue; sourcing costs; flexibility and agility, which I know is a bit of an intangible, but is so important for sourcing destinations, especially today; risks of labor and social compliance; and then risks of environmental compliance. Not surprisingly, the most balanced suppliers turned out to be China and Vietnam, of course, from Asia, which we have seen that those are the most popular destinations. But also here in Western Hemisphere, that Mexico and CAFTA suppliers also have a very balanced, good distribution of sourcing practices and that perspective from the sourcing executives who completed the survey. For the US, for example, obviously speed to market is good there, but the price component is, definitely more difficult. For many of the suppliers, speed to market is the issue, and of course that's driven by geographic proximity more than anything else, but speed to market can be improved. And I think what we are seeing is that there are terrific opportunities for other suppliers outside of China to expand their sales to the US market for apparel. One more figure just to show that kind of shows the trends in the market shares, where we had the huge dip from Chinese imports to the US market. And now as a percent of the market share, they have rebounded, particularly on the quantity side versus the value side. But let's see what happens with the June data, of course. I'm going to just I wanted to mention briefly, because one area that we at USFIA have long encouraged is for our members to use free trade agreements. The US doesn't have as many free trade agreements as a lot of other countries, but for those that we do have, we continue to have pretty low utilization rates. And I wanted to just note, because I think it was very interesting, that in 2020 compared to past years, we saw more of the sourcing executives using the Korea Free Trade Agreement, which seems a little surprising perhaps, but particularly for inputs, we're relying on Korea, AGOA, so that we see a continued expansion in trade with African countries that can ship duty-free to the US market, even in the face of COVID. And in Egypt with the qualified industrial zones, which allow duty-free from most of Egypt to the US for apparel, and has proven to be a very popular program. So there's a lot more in the report, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but we went into more depth on compliance and sustainability, looking at sourcing portfolios and strategies going forward, particularly asking companies to guess for us, to predict where they might increase or decrease sourcing in the next 2 years. Some of the trade policy priorities that for us as an organization are very important in our advocacy efforts, and then non-tariff barriers facing US companies in sourcing, and of course as global retailers and brands in sales around the world. So I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to share some insights into our survey today, and look forward to having a question or two as we move forward. So thank you.
So Julie, thank you again for the wonderful detailed set of data that you were sharing with us from the United States perspective and from the survey from your members. I think this was very, very interesting. And especially you were mentioning some points, and not only the very obvious one, COVID, but also other things like trade conflicts are evolving between the United States and other countries that you were sourcing from in the fashion industry, that impacted obviously also some of the facts and figures, like how the shifts in trade happen really from the US perspective. So we saw a lot of shifts from China to Vietnam even taking now the lead slightly in the trade, which is I think the first time in the history, so far as I know the numbers. So when we look at this, what from your perspective is currently politically happening with impact on the apparel and the fashion industry, and how would you think like the upcoming election will impact this further?
Yeah, so for those of us here in the US, we're focused on COVID every day. We're focused on the retail numbers every day, and we're focused on the politics every day. So with our presidential campaign, plus many of our legislative leaders are also up for re-election in November, we kind of have, critical mass of concerns of what's going to come next. The Trump administration has been very focused on trade wars, and particularly has stepped up the anti-China rhetoric now. And what I suspect we're going to see during the political campaign this year is anti-China rhetoric from both sides, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. There's a lot of focus on, so who to blame for COVID, who to blame for what's happening in trade, loss of jobs. I think that we're going to see a pretty aggressive Trump administration in their final months here, but also on the Democratic side, a expression of, we want to return to the global community. We don't really want to cut ourselves off as much as the current administration has, but what exactly that means for policy, we're not really sure. For those of us in the retail sector, obviously we're concerned whenever we have a lot of anti-trade rhetoric. Might that translate into more difficulties or more legislative action? I'm not sure that we're going to see a lot more legislative action between now and the end of the year. nor do I think we're going to see very much positive, because the U.S. is trying to negotiate new free trade agreements with the United Kingdom before we hit Brexit date. And we also just started talks with Kenya to look once again at expanding our relationship with Africa. But honestly, I don't see a lot that's going to be finalized between now and the end of the year, but a lot of tough rhetoric that's going to make it difficult for those of us who believe in fashion made possible by global trade.
And when we look probably 3 years in the future, so what would be your outlook where the United States fashion industry would be going for 3 years ahead?
I'm more optimistic than the respondents were to our survey. I think, right now we're at the bottom. I mean, right now we are trying to deal with so many issues that make it difficult for companies and for everyone who works there to know what the path forward is. But by 3 years from now, I think we'll be past the worst of the pandemic, right? We're going to be beyond this. We'll have a vaccine, we'll have treatments. Hopefully we'll be meeting again in person and have the chance to, also return to kind of normal business operations as well. So I'm pretty optimistic for 3 years from now, but I think in the short term, it's hard to see when that turnaround really starts.
Julie, thank you very much for these insights. Very interesting. And I think it's very interesting also for the visitors of this venue to have a perspective from inside the United States, because many people might have a look from outside and not really understanding what's happening inside. What is the inside perspective? What are the outlooks and perceptions there? So thank you for sharing the numbers. Thank you for sharing your insights and your judgment on that. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the chance to join you, and hello, everyone.